conversation that we're having here tonight, if you think any of this wonkiness is going to deal with this dark psychic force of the collectivized hatred that this president is bringing up in this country, then I'm afraid that the Democrats are going to see some very dark days. We need to say it like it is. It's bigger than Flint. It's all over this country. It's particularly people of color. It's particularly people who do not have the money to fight back. And if the Democrats don't start saying it, then why would those people feel that they're there for us? And if those people don't feel it, they won't vote for us, and Donald Trump will win.
Welcome back to Politics Tonight. My next guest became the most searched for candidate during July's presidential debates, thanks in part to her answers like that. Amidst a crowded field of seasoned politicians, Marianne Williamson stands out by combining her background in spiritual guidance and politics. And this weekend, she's bringing her campaign here to Chicago. Best-selling author and Democratic presidential candidate Marianne Williamson joins us tonight live in our WGN studio. So good to see you. Thank you for coming in.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So, 13 books, 6 times on the New York Times bestseller list, creating Project Angel. You're all about people. But now the intersection of spirituality and politics are upon you and therefore upon us. Talk about your background and how it prepares you to become president.
Well, what you just said, it's all about people. I've had 35 years of a career working very up close and personal with people, particularly during times of crisis. And over the last 20 years, I've seen how many of the personal crises that people go through in this country are due, at least in large part, to bad public policy. So I have a lot of insight, I believe, into what policies have caused those crises and what it will take to transform them.
You know you're polling at a very low number, about 1% in the polls. But as I said, you're the most #1 searched person on the internet. My question is, why hasn't that translated to a big boost in the polls like other candidates?
I'll tell you why, because those polls are they're a very opaque process. It's basically the equivalent of the superdelegates. They're polling people who are considered, quote unquote, likely Democratic voters, people who have voted in the primaries before. Many of the people who are my supporters say they've never been real involved in politics before. They've voted, most of them, but not necessarily in Democratic primaries. A lot of people who are independents, even a lot of people who aren't necessarily, have not considered themselves Democrats. So these polls are a skewed representation of what's really going on the ground.
I know whenever you're given a question along the lines of you've never served in politics, though you did run for Congress.
I did run for Congress.
You came in 4th out of 18.
And I've been a political activist for my entire adult life.
Okay. Right? So I know when you're asked about you don't have the political background, your answer is, well, all you got to do is take a look at the White House and we see people that don't have a political background serving.
Well, I think it's more, what about the people who do? Very experienced politicians led us into Iraq. Very experienced politicians led us into Vietnam. Very experienced politicians got us to where we are. Not that I am in any way denigrating political expertise, because it's important, but we need moral certitude right now. We need a political visionary more than we need political mechanics. We have plenty of good political mechanics, and we need them. But it's not, you can have the best car mechanic in the world, but they don't necessarily know what road you should drive. It's the road we're on that's the problem, not the state of the car.
You have written in your latest book that we don't need a progressive politics or a conservative politics. We need a deeply human politics, and we need a course correction.
Yeah.
Would you have said that if you were running after, say, an Obama second term, or is this course correction because of the Trump presidency?
Well, that's interesting that you say that. My first book, Healing the Soul of America, came out in 1997. We were already off track. Mass incarceration, wealth inequality, corporate dominance, undue influence of wealth on our politics, it was already happening towards the end of the 90s. People just didn't want to look at it. And now these things have exploded in our faces. We have a lot of stresses. We have some stage 4 cancers right now that we used to that were already there as stage 1 cancers at the end of the 1990s. I didn't just wake up one day and say, oh, I was talking about these things very early on.
We get a lot of ideas from you when you're up there. I mean, it's a very, I have to tell you, the people who are rabidly in favor of you are really that. I hear from them all the time on my social media. People who love you absolutely love you. That being said, if people are looking, say, for a female candidate, you have Elizabeth Warren, who gives so many specific plans, right? The shirt says, I have a plan for that.
Yes.
I see you as more of an idea candidate. Fair enough, or no?
No, actually, and I do adore Elizabeth Warren. I think she's wonderful. I have plans. I mean, if you look at my website at marianne2020.com, I have as much plans, as many plans and policies as anyone. I talk about establishment of a Department of Children and Youth. I talk about establishment of a Department of Peace. I'm all over it with plans. It's just that the plans on a a certain level, treat symptoms, and we must also treat cause. So we have to have a more expanded conversation about what's deeply wrong, which is on a moral level. We need a season of moral repair. You know, Franklin Roosevelt said that the primary role of the presidency, he said, is not the administrative aspect. He said that's secondary, and that the primary role is the role of moral leadership, and that's what I feel I bring to the table.
Indeed, you quote him in your book, that very
I
quote.
Do.
When I think of what elected President Trump, I'm doing that comparison because he's currently the president. He would be your opponent. He ran as a disruptor, right? That's what people who love him. He's a disruptor. You say your campaign is not just a better version of the same old politics, but a genuine pattern of disruption. So what do you say to people who say, we've been dealing with a disruptor, I'm not sure that's what we want?
Well, I believe that both Trump and Bernie Sanders in the 2016 election spoke to the rage that people felt and that people legitimately felt. Their rage was valid. Their rage of the American people, when you have almost 1/3 of the American people who live with chronic economic anxiety, people had a reason to have this cry of populist despair in the 2016 election. It was either going to be an authoritarian populism or a progressive populism. But remember, Bernie Sanders was as much of a disruptor in the 2016 election as Trump was. Unfortunately, we went with the disruptor who's not just a disruptor, he blows the whole thing up. We need change, we do not need chaos. And as president, that's what I would hope to be, an agent of change. But we don't need an agent of chaos, and that obviously is what we have now.
So when I announced on social media today you would be here, I invited people connected with me to submit questions if they wanted to. So I'm going to give you one of those.
Okay.
One from a viewer who said, why you over, and he said over Elizabeth Warren or Amy Klobuchar. When I read that, I thought maybe he's just thinking female candidates. So you got to add in Kamala Harris, you've got to add in Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, so there's others you got to put in there, but
well,
you can take the question.
I have great respect for Tulsi, because Tulsi and I really are the only people talking about the over-influence of defense contractors and the defense industry in the setting of our national security agenda. So I agree with Tulsi on that. In terms of economic issues, I'm very much aligned with Elizabeth. In terms of Kamala and Amy, my policies are not, we're not as aligned politically, that's all. Look, it needs to be a Democrat, so any of those people, but in terms of those other things, my politics are pretty dissimilar in some ways.
All right. Any presidential candidate who's on the show will give questions as I will to you about health care and all the kind of stuff. But I also like to be specific about specific candidates' programs. You mentioned these before, but I want to talk about some. One, reparations. You have made that a pillar of your campaign. You have lots of Democrats who might agree with you about the notion of reparations, but it's a pillar for you. You want to disperse $200 to $500 billion over 10 years.
20 years.
Okay.
20 years.
10 years somewhere, but okay, we'll take it over 20 years. In order to kind of level the playing field, why is this a burning issue for you when the country is where it is right now?
Because I want to preside over a season of moral repair. And whether you're a country or an individual, you cannot have the future you want unless and until you're willing to clean up the past. You know, Germany has paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations since World War II. Doesn't mean the Holocaust didn't happen, but it's gone far towards establishing reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Europe. Now, you've also got to remember, reparations is a stimulus. It's an economic stimulus. The stipulation is that that money be applied for purposes of economic and educational renewal. There was a study done very recently that if black families created as much wealth as white families, our economy would be $1.5 trillion larger. So this is one of those areas where when anybody wins, everybody wins.
When you got some real response during one of the debates when you said we don't need a Department of War, we need a Department of Peace.
Well, we need the Department of Defense too.
Okay, but I'm going there.
Yeah.
Because essentially what I want to say is when I look at what your Department of Peace is, as I did homework about it, it seemed very domestic policy to me.
No, it's domestic and international.
It was, but at least I was picking up the gun violence issues and all those kind of things. But talk about, for those people who think when you say peace, not war, maybe it sounds naive to them. So you can clarify it.
Hardly naive. What's naive is to think we can continue the way we're continuing on this planet and not reach inevitable disaster on some global level beyond what we can control. You can't just take medicine, you also cultivate health. And we can't just endlessly prepare for war as the sole focus of our national security agenda. You're not going to just back up into peace. So you need to cultivate peace the way you cultivate health. And so I believe that we should have our peace-building agencies given the same robust and simultaneous support and resources as those who need to prepare for war. So I see the Defense Department, for instance, and the U.S. military, for which I have great respect. My father fought in World War II. I see the military like a surgeon. Does the United States need to have the best surgeon? Of course we do. But you don't have surgery if you don't need it. We also need to build up the health of society. And those peace-building factors are expanding economic opportunities for women around the world, expanding educational opportunities for children, reducing violence against women, and ameliorating unnecessary human suffering. We should see large groups of desperate people as a national security risk. Because war is the absence of peace. Peace is not the absence of war. But when you have a $760 billion military budget and then a $40 billion State Department budget. I mean, even Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense under George Bush, said we must learn to wage peace. Then within the State Department, we have a $17 billion USAID, long-term development and humanitarian assistance, and less than $1 billion that goes specifically to peace building. I want those equal. I want a peace-building academy just like we have a military academy.
Okay, we're going to take a break. When we come back, got to get your opinions on things that people think about every day, like health care, and we'll do that with Marianne Williamson when we come back. Stay with us.